Let me tell you something right now. What you watched in those final seconds was not simply a basketball play. It wasn't just a game-winning shot. It wasn't merely another viral highlight destined to dominate sports television for the next 24 hours. What you witnessed was something much bigger. It was a collision between preparation and improvisation, between coaching strategy and player instinct, between the play that was drawn up and the play that actually saved the Indiana Fever. I'm Dre Fiber, this is Street Hoops, and today we're pulling back every layer of what really happened during those final moments. Because the version of the story most people are telling is only half the story. The highlight is easy. The context is where things get interesting. Let's start where every real basketball conversation should start, with the facts. The Indiana Fever were leading by 17 points. 17. That is not a small lead. That is not a two-possession game. That is a cushion large enough that most teams should be able to close things out without needing a miracle. Yet somehow, possession by possession, the lead disappeared. The Washington Mystics chipped away. Indiana's offense slowed down. The momentum shifted. What had once looked like a comfortable victory slowly transformed into a tense, nerve-wracking battle that nobody expected. By the time the final minute arrived, the Fever found themselves fighting for survival. And that is where this story truly begins. Because when the timeout was called and players gathered around the huddle, everyone assumed the coaching staff was drawing up the play that would decide the game. A whiteboard, a few seconds, one final opportunity, everything on the line. According to discussions that emerged after the game, the original action appeared to be designed around getting Kelsey Mitchell involved as a primary scoring option. Now, let me be clear. Kelsey Mitchell is an outstanding player. She's tough. She's fearless. She's capable of scoring in bunches. No one is questioning her ability. But many fans immediately began asking the obvious question. In a game-defining moment, with one shot to save the night, shouldn't the ball find its way to Caitlin Clark? That's a debate that exploded after the final buzzer. Because what happened on the floor looked very different from what many expected. And the person who deserves enormous credit is Sophie Cunningham. When the ball was placed in her hands for the inbound pass, she wasn't simply memorizing a diagram. She was reading the defense. She was processing information in real time. She was watching defenders communicate, or more accurately, fail to communicate. On the weak side of the floor, Washington's coverage briefly broke down. Two defenders found themselves focused on the same action. Assignments became unclear. For a split second, confusion appeared. And in basketball, a split second is all it takes. Most players never notice that opening. Great players do. Sophie Cunningham noticed it immediately. Instead of forcing the pass toward the original action, she trusted what her eyes were telling her. She saw Caitlin Clark, open, available, dangerous, and she made the pass. Not because the whiteboard told her to, not because the crowd demanded it, because the defense gave her the opportunity. The ball arrived in Clark's hands. The clock was nearly gone. The defense was late, and everyone in the building suddenly understood what was about to happen. Clark rose up from well beyond the arc, released the shot, and delivered one of the most memorable moments of the Fever season. Nothing but net. Game over. Fever win. The celebration that followed was pure chaos. Players sprinted onto the court. The bench exploded. Fans lost their minds. And social media immediately turned the shot into an instant classic. But buried beneath all that celebration was one detail that completely changed the conversation. After the game, comments from within the team suggested that the final possession didn't unfold exactly as originally planned. Think about what that means. Not exactly as planned. That's a fascinating statement. Because players could have simply praised the execution and moved on. They could have credited Clark's shot-making ability. They could have talked about teamwork. Instead, the suggestion was that the possession evolved organically once the ball was put into play. And that's where basketball becomes beautiful. Because coaches draw up plays. Players solve problems. No coach can predict every defensive rotation. No whiteboard can account for every mistake. No diagram survives perfectly once the ball is live. The best teams understand that. The best players understand it even better. Sometimes the difference between winning and losing comes down to a player recognizing something the defense didn't expect. That's exactly what happened here. Cunningham saw an opportunity. Clark capitalized on it. Everything else became history. Now, some fans have interpreted this sequence as evidence of larger issues within Indiana's offensive approach. Others view it as a perfect example of players making smart adjustments within the framework of a design play. Both viewpoints have merit. What cannot be debated is the outcome. The Fever escaped with a victory, but they also walked away with questions. Questions about execution. Questions about consistency. Questions about how a team with a 17-point lead found itself needing a miracle in the first place. Those questions won't disappear because of one incredible shot. As spectacular as Clark's three-pointer was, it doesn't erase the problems that nearly put Indiana in that position. It simply covered them for one night. And maybe that's why this moment resonates so strongly, because it represents both the promise and the challenge of this Fever team. The promise is obvious. When everything is falling apart, Indiana has a player capable of producing magic. A player capable of changing an entire game with a single possession. A player willing to take the biggest shot when the pressure is highest. That's a luxury very few teams possess. The challenge is equally obvious. Championship contenders cannot rely on miracles every night. Eventually, the process has to become as reliable as the talent. Eventually, the execution has to match the potential. But for one unforgettable moment in Washington, none of those concerns mattered. Because Sophie Cunningham trusted her instincts. Because Caitlin Clark trusted her shot. And because basketball at its best often rewards players brave enough to ignore the script and create something even better. That is what happened. That is why the Fever won. And that is why people are still talking about it long after the final buzzer sounded. That wasn't a standard basketball possession. That wasn't simply a last-second play unfolding the way coaches dream it up on whiteboards. What happened in those final seconds looked a lot more like two veteran competitors recognizing an opportunity and trusting their instincts over the original script. Think about it for a moment. You come out of a timeout. The coaches have just spent precious seconds explaining exactly how the possession is supposed to unfold. The clipboard is put away. The players break the huddle. Then somewhere between the sideline and the inbound spot, two players read the floor, see something unexpected, and make a split-second decision. Not because they're trying to ignore their coaches. Not because they're trying to prove a point. Because they believe there's a better option available. And when that option ends with a game-winning three-pointer, the entire conversation changes. That's what makes this situation so fascinating. Because once that shot drops through the net, what exactly is the coaching response supposed to be? How do you criticize a decision that delivered victory? How do you walk into the next film session and explain that players should have stayed on script when the off-script adjustment produced the biggest moment of the game? You can't easily do that. And that reality creates a fascinating dynamic for everyone involved. In my view, one of the biggest heroes of this sequence was Sophie Cunningham. Everyone is going to remember Caitlin Clark hitting the shot. That's inevitable. Big-time players make big-time shots, and Clark delivered when the moment demanded. But before the shot comes the decision. Before the celebration comes the read. Before the highlight comes the pass. Cunningham saw something the defense didn't. She recognized a breakdown. She trusted her instincts, and she delivered the ball exactly where it needed to go. That level of awareness is elite basketball intelligence. Not every player sees that opening. Not every player has the confidence to act on it. Sophie Cunningham did both. Now let's shift the conversation towards Stephanie White, because that's where much of the post-game discussion has centered. The press conference itself raised plenty of eyebrows. When reporters asked about the game-winning possession and whether it unfolded as designed, White gave credit to assistant coach Austin Kelly for drawing up the play. That answer immediately sparked debate. Not because coaches shouldn't credit their assistants. Good coaching staffs operate collaboratively all the time. But because the response raised larger questions about how responsibilities are divided during critical moments. Fans naturally began asking what role each member of the staff plays during those late-game situations. Who designs the actions? Who determines the primary options? Who makes the final decisions? Those questions aren't criticisms. They're simply the kinds of questions that arise when a team wins dramatic games in dramatic fashion. And Austin Kelly's name has surfaced repeatedly throughout the season in discussions about late-game execution. Several important possessions have reportedly involved concepts or actions associated with Kelly's offensive designs. That doesn't diminish Stephanie White's role as head coach, but it does highlight how many moving pieces are involved behind the scenes. Basketball fans often view coaching as a one-person operation. The reality is much more complicated. Entire staffs contribute ideas, adjustments, and game plans. Still, because White is the head coach, the spotlight ultimately lands on her. That's part of the job description. The praise goes to the head coach. The criticism goes to the head coach. And when questions emerge about offensive philosophy or player usage, those questions naturally lead back to her office. Which brings us to another moment from the game that generated enormous discussion among Fever fans. There was a sequence where Caitlin Clark appeared ready to re-enter the game. She was at the scorer's table. She looked prepared to check in, and she remained on the bench. The cameras caught her reaction, and immediately social media went into overdrive. People began interpreting facial expressions. They began assigning emotions. They began constructing narratives. Some saw frustration. Others saw confusion. Some believed it was simply a player eager to get back on the floor. The truth is that only the people directly involved know exactly what was being discussed in that moment. But what cannot be disputed is how invested people have become in every aspect of Caitlin Clark's career. Every substitution becomes a story. Every timeout becomes a debate. Every coaching decision becomes a headline. That's a reality that comes with being one of the biggest stars in sports. And that's where the broader conversation becomes important. Caitlin Clark isn't just another talented player. She's one of the most influential athletes in basketball today. She attracts attention wherever she goes. She drives television ratings. She fills arenas. She generates conversations that extend far beyond the sport itself. The impact is undeniable. Because of that, every decision involving her receives extraordinary scrutiny. If she's on the floor, people analyze every possession. If she's on the bench, people ask why. If a final shot goes to another player, fans want answers. If she takes the final shot, they want explanations for how it happened. That's the environment surrounding the Fever right now. And to be fair, it exists because Clark has earned that attention through her play. The expectations are enormous. The spotlight is constant. The pressure is relentless. Yet moments like this game-winning sequence also highlight why so many people are captivated by her. When the game reached its most critical moment, Clark was ready. The defense made a mistake. Cunningham saw it. The pass arrived, and Clark delivered. That's what great players do. They turn small opportunities into unforgettable moments. The larger debates about coaching philosophy, rotations, substitutions, and offensive systems will continue. Fans will keep discussing them. Analysts will keep dissecting them. And the Fever organization will continue searching for the formula that maximizes all of the talent on its roster. But on this particular night, one thing became crystal clear. When everything was on the line, when the game hung in the balance, and when one possession would determine the outcome, the ball found Caitlin Clark. And once it did, the rest was history. That's why people are still talking about it. That's why the debate isn't going away. And that's why every move this team makes from this point forward will be watched more closely than ever. You do not build an offensive system so rigid, so predictable, and so disconnected from the strengths of your best player that the only way to generate a game-winning shot is for your players to abandon the original plan altogether. Yet that is exactly why this moment has become so fascinating. Because the deeper people look at those final seconds, the less it feels like a perfectly executed coaching masterpiece, and the more it feels like a pair of players recognizing an opportunity and trusting their instincts. And that raises uncomfortable questions. Not because the Fever won. They did. Not because Caitlin Clark delivered. She absolutely did. But because the sequence that saved the game appears to have emerged from real-time player decision-making rather than a flawless execution of the original design. That matters. Because when teams consistently find themselves relying on improvisation in moments that should be organized, people begin asking whether the larger system is functioning the way it should. Now let's talk about what happened after the shot, because that's where the conversation really exploded. The internet has analyzed every frame, every facial expression, every reaction, every interaction on the floor. And while it's easy to dismiss that as overanalysis, there are reasons people became so interested in those moments. When a coach watches her team hit a game-winning buzzer beater, most fans expect an emotional release. They expect celebration. They expect excitement. They expect the visible joy that comes from seeing a high-pressure situation end in success. Instead, many viewers felt that Stephanie White's reaction looked unusually restrained. Some interpreted it as composure. Others interpreted it as surprise. Still others believed she appeared more focused on processing what had happened than celebrating it. Of course, body language can be deceptive. Cameras capture fractions of seconds, and fans often project their own narratives onto what they see. Different coaches express emotion differently. Some jump into celebrations. Others remained calm even during the biggest moments. But because the final possession had already generated questions about whether the play unfolded exactly as designed, every reaction afterward became part of the discussion. Then came Caitlin Clark's celebration. Clark immediately embraced the moment. She celebrated with teammates. She enjoyed the energy of the crowd reaction. She carried herself exactly the way most star players do after hitting a game-winning shot. What drew attention, however, was the interaction fans focused on most. Many observers noticed how quickly Clark connected with Sophie Cunningham after the play. And from there, countless interpretations emerged. Some fans saw nothing unusual. Others viewed it as evidence of trust between two players who had just created a special moment together. Regardless of interpretation, one thing is undeniable. Cunningham played a critical role. Without the read she made on the inbound, there is no shot. Without the pass, there is no highlight. Without her willingness to react to what she saw unfolding defensively, the possession may have ended very differently. That reality has elevated Cunningham's role in the story from supporting character to central figure. Because while Clark finished the play, Cunningham helped create it, and that distinction matters. Now let's widen the lens and look at the broader reaction surrounding the Fever organization. What's fascinating is that despite the victory, many fans left the game feeling more concerned than reassured. Normally, a dramatic road win creates optimism. Normally, a buzzer beater becomes a rallying point. Normally, the conversation focuses on resilience and execution. Instead, a significant portion of the discussion immediately shifted toward coaching. Why? Because many fans believe the game never should have reached that point in the first place. The Fever once held a double-digit advantage. They appeared to be in control. Yet as the game progressed, the lead disappeared. By the final possession, Indiana needed heroics simply to avoid what would have been a deeply frustrating loss. That context changes everything. A game-winning shot is exciting. A game-winning shot that becomes necessary because a large lead evaporated creates a different conversation entirely. And that's the conversation many Fever supporters are having today. The recurring argument isn't that Clark saved the team once. It's that she keeps finding herself in positions where she has to save the team. Those are two very different things. One is a testament to greatness. The other is a question about process. That's why so many discussions after the game weren't focused on the final shot itself. They were focused on everything that happened before it. The stagnant possessions, the offensive droughts, the momentum swings, the inability to protect a substantial lead. For many observers, the game-winning three felt less like confirmation that everything is working and more like evidence that extraordinary talent is covering up larger structural problems. Whether that's fair or not is open to debate, but it's undeniably the narrative gaining momentum. And when you examine Indiana's roster, it's easy to understand why expectations remain so high. This team possesses talent across multiple positions. Caitlin Clark is one of the most dynamic offensive players in basketball. Kelsey Mitchell remains an elite scoring threat. Aaliyah Boston continues to provide stability, toughness, and production in the paint. The supporting pieces offer depth, shooting, versatility, and athleticism. On paper, the ingredients are there, which is exactly why every inconsistency receives so much attention. Fans look at the roster and see championship potential. When the results fail to match those expectations consistently, scrutiny naturally shifts toward coaching philosophy and system design. That's where much of the criticism aimed at Stephanie White originates. Not from one game, not from one possession, but from a growing belief among portions of the fan base that the team's talent ceiling remains higher than what is currently being displayed. Whether that perception is accurate will ultimately be determined over the course of the season. Winning has a way of silencing criticism. Losing has a way of amplifying it. And dramatic finishes only intensify the conversation. What's particularly interesting is how different this story could have been. Imagine if the original action unfolded exactly as intended. Imagine if Kelsey Mitchell received the ball, created a shot, and scored. The Fever still win. The headlines are cleaner. The post-game discussion is simpler. The focus remains on execution rather than improvisation. Instead, what happened was something far more complicated. A defensive breakdown appeared. A player made a read. An inbound pass changed direction. Caitlin Clark got the ball. The shot fell. And suddenly everyone began asking questions that had little to do with the actual basket itself. That's why this moment feels bigger than one game. because it didn't create the conversation. It revealed it. The concerns, the frustrations, the debates about offensive philosophy, player usage, and coaching decisions were already there. The game-winning shot simply brought them to the surface. And now, the Fever move forward carrying both realities at once. They won, but the questions didn't disappear. In many ways, they only became louder. It feels like this entire situation was waiting for one defining moment to bring everything bubbling beneath the surface into plain view. Not create the conversation, but expose it. The questions were already there. The frustrations were already there. The debates about coaching, offensive philosophy, player usage, and leadership were already happening. What that game-winning shot did was force people to connect the dots. Think about all the pieces that have fueled discussion over the last several days. The final possession ending with Caitlin Clark instead of Kelsey Mitchell. The comments made afterward suggesting the play did not unfold exactly as originally designed. The post-game press conference where credit for the design was directed toward assistant coach Austin Kelly. The reactions on the sideline. The celebrations on the court. Individually, each moment can be explained away, put together. They create a narrative that many fans are finding increasingly difficult to ignore. And whether you agree with that narrative or not, it's impossible to deny that people are paying attention. Now let's talk about Austin Kelly for a minute because his name keeps surfacing in these conversations, and usually for positive reasons. Every time discussions turn toward Indiana's most effective late-game possessions, Kelly's fingerprints seem to be somewhere nearby. Fans point to creative out-of-bounds plays. They point to well-designed late clock actions. They point to offensive sets that create quality opportunities when the pressure is highest. Again and again, Kelly's name enters the discussion. That's not meant to diminish anyone else on the coaching staff. Successful teams require collaboration. Assistant coaches play major roles in preparation, strategy, scouting, and game management. But when one assistant repeatedly becomes associated with some of a team's best offensive moments, people naturally begin asking questions about the overall coaching structure. And if Indiana ultimately becomes a legitimate championship contender, Kelly's contributions will undoubtedly be part of that story. Now let's zoom out and address the larger question that has dominated fan discussions. Is Stephanie White the right coach for this particular team? Notice the wording. This isn't a question about whether she's knowledgeable. She clearly understands basketball. This isn't a question about character. By all accounts, she's respected throughout the league. The question being asked by many fans is much narrower and much more specific. Is she the ideal coach for a roster built around Caitlin Clark? That's the debate. Because coaching isn't only about basketball knowledge. It's about fit. Some coaches thrive with veteran defensive teams. Some thrive with young rebuilding groups. Some excel in structured systems. Others flourish when given creative, free-flowing talent. Every coaching situation is different. And throughout this season, critics have pointed to several recurring issues. They point to offensive stretches that appear stagnant. They point to rotations they don't understand. They point to moments where Clark seems underutilized relative to her talents. They point to late-game situations that generate more questions than answers. Whether those criticisms are fair is ultimately up for debate. But the fact that they continue surfacing after wins, as well as losses, says something important. The concerns aren't disappearing. In fact, they're growing louder. Because here's the challenge facing Indiana. A game-winning shot can solve a scoreboard problem. It can't solve every underlying concern. A dramatic victory can temporarily quiet criticism. It cannot permanently erase it. That's why so many people left this game talking about the process rather than the result. The Fever won. Yet much of the conversation focused on what went wrong before the final shot. That's unusual. Most teams hit a game winner and spend days celebrating. Indiana hit a game winner and immediately found itself at the center of another coaching debate. That alone tells you how much scrutiny surrounds this franchise right now. And there is a practical reason for that. The expectations are enormous. When you have a player like Caitlin Clark, expectations change. Every possession matters more. Every coaching decision receives more attention. Every substitution becomes a talking point. Every timeout becomes a discussion. Because people believe this team is capable of something special. The roster is talented. The star power is undeniable. The potential ceiling remains incredibly high, which is exactly why fans become frustrated when they feel the team isn't maximizing what it has. The biggest concern many observers have isn't that Indiana occasionally struggles. Every team struggles. The concern is whether the Fever are relying too heavily on individual brilliance to overcome larger problems. Because there is a difference between winning through execution and winning through rescue missions. The best teams consistently generate quality opportunities. They don't constantly require miracles. And while Clark has repeatedly shown she can deliver in defining moments, no organization wants its entire season dependent on one player saving the day night after night. Eventually opponents adjust. Eventually luck changes. Eventually the margin for error disappears. That's why the conversations surrounding coaching, structure, and defensive philosophy continue to matter. Not because Indiana lost, because they didn't. Not because Clark failed, because she didn't. But because many people believe the team should be operating at an even higher level than it currently is. And that's what makes this entire story so fascinating. The Fever walked away with a victory. Clark delivered another signature moment. Sophie Cunningham made a brilliant read. Austin Kelly received praise for his role in late-game design. Yet somehow, the dominant conversation afterward wasn't celebration. It was analysis. It was questioning. It was debate. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when expectations exceed results. And right now, expectations around Indiana are as high as they've been in years. Maybe the concerns are overblown. Maybe the team eventually finds its rhythm and silences every critic. Maybe the coaching staff and players continue evolving together, and this becomes nothing more than a footnote in a successful season. Or maybe this game becomes remembered as the moment when existing concerns became impossible to ignore. Either way, one thing is clear. People are watching. People are analyzing. And every game from this point forward is going to be examined under an even brighter spotlight. That's all for today's discussion. If you've stayed with me through this entire breakdown, I appreciate it. Drop your thoughts below. What do you think really happened on that final possession? How much credit belongs to Clark, Cunningham, and the coaching staff? And where do you stand on the bigger questions surrounding the Fever moving forward? I'm Dre Fiver. This has been Street Hoops, and I'll catch you in the next one.